Hello, I'm Lucy from Bookags and I'm here today with my next two Man Booker long list reviews. 4 books down for me, 3 books down for Scott. I'm technically in the lead already, although I did get a bit of a head start, but I am about to streak towards the winner's podium because I've got 2 more Man Booker long list books to talk to you about today. The first of which is Everything Under by Daisy Johnson, and the other one I read was In Our Mad and Furious City by Guy Gunaratne. Read this one first, so I'll talk about this one first. It is the story primarily of a woman called Gretel. Now she is in her late 20s, I think, and when we meet her, she is living with her elderly mother who has dementia. But what we quite quickly discover is that until very, very recently, Gretel was estranged from her mother. She hadn't seen her, I think it's for 16 years. Now, in that time, Gretel spent a lot of time sort of processing her childhood and actually deliberately forgetting bits of it. But there is a theme that runs through this book, which is about sort of fate and destiny and whether our choices really hold any worth in life, or whether we are predetermined to do things and be the people that we end up being. Because Gretel has grown up to be there's a technical term for it that begins with L that I can't remember, lexicographer, a dictionary person, someone who edits dictionary entries. And this is relevant because when she was younger and before her mother abandoned her, they lived together on a canal boat, and they had basically their own language that they made up, and they communicated a little bit in English, but in a little bit in their own constructed world that no one else really knew. And that leads sort of to the second theme that this book addresses quite heavily, which is around sort of identity. Now, the plot of this book is sort of Gretel trying to get to know her mother again and piece together her childhood as her mother's dementia sort of takes over, and specifically to piece together events that happened when she was 13, the winter of the year she turned 13, and they were joined on their canal boat, or their riverboat, by a young man, a young runaway called Marcus. And Gretel is sort of desperately trying to remember what happened that changed their lives then, and sort of why it happened and how it has led to sort of the rest of her life taking the path that it has taken. Now, there were things I really liked about this book, and there were things that I didn't like so much. The first thing that's worth saying, which you might already be thinking from everything that I've just told you, is goodness me, there is an awful lot going on in this book, and there really, really is. There's an awful lot going on in not a lot of pages. And actually, I liked how daring and how ambitious it was to try and do all of these things. But actually I think it could have done with doing just a few less, because we're looking at dementia and we're looking at this broken down relationship. We're looking at people living a life or sort of on the outskirts of society. We're looking at this other character, Marcus, coming in and why he's run away from his family, and all these things are just squished in there a little bit too tightly for my liking. However, the real strength of this book is the prose, I think, actually. It is written in really accomplished and beautiful prose, and I really, really liked that. And actually what I say sort of about characters living on sort of the fringes of society can be brought in then, actually, because it reminds me of a book that I read a few years ago called Pollack by Laura Beatty, which it's got this sort of same organic, folksy vibe that's running through it about people who sort of live in this British wilderness. Sorry, it is set in Britain. I think it's supposed to be Oxfordshire or Cambridgeshire. It's like one of the sort of home counties. But these people who live on these boats and these barges aren't sort of part of regular society. They've created their own worlds, and there's sort of things there about, you know, if crimes are committed, or if people, they don't call the police, if people are ill, they don't call the emergency services, they just sort of survive and exist on their own. And those themes were really interesting to me, and the execution of sort of creating this organic, folksy place through this beautiful prose was really, really well done, I thought. It's also worth saying that this book is based on a really well-known mythical story. It's a retelling, ultimately. I'm not going to tell you what it is a retelling of. If you want to know, a very quick Google will sort that out for you. But actually, one of the other problems that I had with this book, other than how much it was trying to do, was this element of mythical retelling, because I knew in advance what the myth was. And actually, because it doesn't challenge the myth really in any way, it doesn't transcend it, it made the plot very predictable. So I knew things that were going to happen before they happened, just because I knew it was based on this myth. But actually, I think had I not known exactly what it was based on, then I might have found the plot a little bit more fresh and a little bit less predictable. I know that sounds really obvious when I say that out loud. If you know what it's about, you're going to know what the plot is. But actually, if you twist and turn myths and you sort of stretch them to their limits, you can still do original things with plot. And I don't think that this does. And by bringing it into the modern setting and throwing all these other elements at it as well, it did feel to me a little bit contrived, sort of the mythical element of it. Sort of, it was a little bit at times crowbarred in. But overall, I did find it an entertaining read in that I was interested in the prose and how that worked. Oh, actually, one more thing I should probably say is that if you read the blurb of this book and you sort of read the press coverage about it, it's sold on the elements of language, so what her job is now and how she goes back to her childhood, and I guess actually sort of explores her relationship with language as well as her mother, and in a sense whether you can talk your fears into existence, I guess, which actually was an element I really liked. Sort of this question about whether if you say something enough, it becomes real, it becomes bigger than just words. But the sort of the language that they created, which sort of is plugged as sort of the selling point and the central point of this book, really wasn't for me. It was actually completely peripheral and irrelevant to the rest of the book. So if you want to read it based on sort of that description, excuse me, possibly not for you. So overall, I sort of respected this book, but the bottom line, which actually I haven't talked about yet because it's not entirely relevant, is that this book is just not for me. And I sort of knew that that was going to be the case before I opened it, because I just really wasn't very interested in the subject matter. And sometimes books can surprise you, even if you think you're not going to like them. But actually, this one, it just didn't. All the different themes and all the different sort of character elements and the plot elements, they just unfortunately weren't for me. It's not that it was poorly executed, it's just subject not my cup of tea. Which is a good place to leave that one and take you on to In Our Mad and Furious City by Guy Gunaratne, which on paper, this was the book that I was going to love. So if I was just, or when I was just looking through the synopses of all the Booker books, this is the one that jumped out at me. This is the one that was in my comfort zone, I guess, in terms of subject matter. And the flip side of this one is actually you can get comfort zone books that appear comfort zone books that actually you can't stand when you actually read them in the end. I should probably tell you what it's about before I tell you what I thought of it, shouldn't I? So this is set in London, and it is a book that is so completely distinctly London. It's not even sort of about Britain. The characterization of the people and the place, it is London through and through. And a bit of an aside, if there's anyone out there in parts of the world that are not Britain, I'd really like to know what you think of it, because I wonder how well it would travel, because it does feel so rooted in London to me, and sort of the themes that it explores, I'll come on to in a minute, are so London, I keep saying London, that I don't know whether the rest of the world will get it. I don't know. Please tell me if you're out there and you've read it. But right, so it's set in London. We've established that. I've said London a lot. This book is set from 5 different perspectives. The 3 main perspectives, I guess, are actually all teenage boys. So boys sort of coming to the end of their teenage years, about to leave school and be out in the big wide world. And they are all children of immigrants. So Sevlon's parents are from the Caribbean, Ardan's mother is from Ireland, and Yusef's parents are of Pakistani Muslims. And they've all grown up in this really deprived city centre estate in London, where sort of all these immigrant communities are thrown together. So they're sort of the 3 main characters, and their narrative is interspersed with the narrative of Nelson, who is Sevlon's father, and Caroline, who is Ardan's mother. The story itself is set over just a 2-day period, I think it is actually, in which racial tensions in London have come to absolute boiling point. There are riots going across the city, and marches that are all stemming from the murder of a British soldier by a young black man. And these boys, Sevlon, Ardan and Yusef, have been drawn together in their friendships throughout the years, just by talking about girls and football, and you know, they're in it for the bants. But now there's all this extra pressure being put on them from the outside, as they're basically trying to just sort of live their lives and avoid the things that are going on around them. Because one of the themes that runs through this novel is all about sort of how your start in life influences your opportunities. So these boys are all coming from a place of very little opportunity, and they have different aspirations. So Sevlon wants to be an athlete, Ardan loves music, but he's not really ever going to do anything about it, you know, because he's afraid. And Yusef's father has recently died, and he's just motivated really by keeping his brother out of trouble, or out of the sphere of influence of the increasingly radical elements at his mosque. So each of them is just sort of trying to lift themselves up from the position of very poor opportunities that they have, whilst this increasing violence is just rising around them. Whilst their parents' narratives are looking back really about what brought them to London in the first place, and the violence that is sort of inherent in their journeys. So for Nelson, that was coming over sort of in the 1950s, I think it was, and the hostility that he faced. And for Caroline, that's about growing up in an IRA family and not being comfortable with that, and not knowing what to do about it. So all of these characters are sort of on the brink of this great violence, and sort of the undertow of this novel is really bleak, and you've got this feeling of impending doom. But actually, it's not as gritty as it promises to be. The absolute strength of this book, in my mind, is the style in which it is written, which is going to be an absolute love or hate style, because it is pretty much entirely, actually no, there's no pretty much about it, it is entirely in phonetic dialogue. And for the young men who serve the bulk of the novel, that means sort of proper street slang. It is written how they talk, and initially you got to tune into that a little bit. You've got to sort of turn your mind around to understand what they're saying. And I know that there were little bits of it and stuff that went over my head, but actually it is done so consistently and so well that it brings the characters really, really vibrantly to life. And I loved it. I loved the style in which it was written. I loved the story overall, actually, or love is maybe a bit of a strong word. I liked it. I really wanted to like it because everything so far that I've read is, I've just been a bit like, yeah, it's okay, it's okay. And I really was rooting to like this novel because on paper, you know, it looks like my thing, and I did like it. But what I say about it not being as gritty as it promises let me down a little bit. I think there's the illusion of it being gritty because of this street slang. It sort of makes you think that it's grittier than it was. But actually, considering that it's all about race relations and the threat of this violence, there are two points I guess that's worth saying. Is that the first is that actually when the violence comes directly to these boys, it isn't as shattering as I thought it could be. Actually, the ending is a little undercooked. I wanted to feel something more powerful. I did feel it, but I was just like, come on, we can do more about this. And actually, it's related to the second point, which I think is that given that this was a book about sort of race relations in London, and it had these three characters from really different backgrounds who are friends, and all the other elements that are fed into it, so sort of the history through their parents that lead to create this sort of uneasy melting pot. Actually, it's done pretty diplomatically. Sort of, I don't want to use the term sugar-coated. What's a bit less than sugar-coated? Lightly dusted with sugar, I think. It's not, I feel like this novel has not set out to offend anyone, or it's trying not to offend anyone, where actually, as a result, it's not adding to the debate or what we already know. It's not adding to our understanding, I guess, about race relations in London, and it's not deepening what we know, which is a shame because I think there was so much potential for it to do that, given what it promises, I guess. So overall, the way in which it was written, absolutely brilliant. Really loved that. The story itself had good aspirations, but I think actually if it had aspirations to not be quite so good and so kind and so delicate, then it might have delivered better. Actually, as I said that, I was like, there were probably no aspirations to be good and kind and delicate, but, or maybe not any conscious ones, but I just wanted it a little bit more of the grit that it promised. So I'd actually probably still say it was my favourite one that I've read so far, possibly. I only finished it yesterday. I've kind of got to sit on them for a little while before I make that assertion. But I think it probably is. But I also think it's probably a comment on the fact that the other ones haven't totally blown me away, rather than this one being absolutely exceptional. I just feel a little tiny bit of a missed opportunity. So they are my thoughts pretty much overall. And as usual, if you've read any of these books, I would love to know your thoughts. Kind of, actually, it doesn't seem like that many people have read these two. It seems like everyone's talking about, you know, all the other ones that everyone's talking about. So if you have read them, I would love to know your thoughts. Please do share them in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to get the rest of the reviews, which are on their way soon. In the meantime, check out bookacts.com and the apps. They're completely free, and I'll see you soon. Thanks for watching.